Good morning. Takes a couple of good mornings to get us going. This is a rowdy crowd, right? Good morning. My name is Don Henninger, and I'm your senior warden. And I'm here this morning to tell you about a little trip we took a couple of months ago to Northern Ireland. In May, in fact, a number of us went to Northern Ireland. It was part of my role with the Arizona Democracy Resilience Network. The ADRN is sponsored by the Carter Center, which is an organization started by former President Jimmy Carter, who turns 100 years old October 1st. And he's still with us, doing well, or at least he's still with us. The motto of the Carter Center is waging peace, fighting disease, and building hope. And it's been doing this for a couple of decades. It's focused on two main areas, basically, fighting tropical diseases and then promoting and protecting democracy around the world. The Carter Center's been doing this in Africa, Latin America, in the Middle East, and the Far East, and until about 2 years ago, not in this country, but about 2 years ago, they said, we've got a problem right here in our own backyard. So they started that for the first time. They're going to start working on developing and protecting and sustaining democracy right here in the United States. So they chose 6 states: Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona. As you can tell, they're all swing states now, so they're really important states as we get into this election season. And most of us have then built networks up in each one of these states. In Arizona, we've got a network of about 300 people or so across Arizona. And in all of our networks, there's been a strong component of faith leaders, which has been really encouraging us for us to see. And we've got about 75 faith leaders in our network throughout Arizona. And we also began a national project that we call Faith Forward. And this is a national group in all 6 of our states that are doing things across the nation, like national prayer days and things like that. We could talk about that in a later meeting, perhaps. But as part of that, the Carter Center invited religious and civic leaders from each one of these 6 states to travel to Belfast to learn about how Northern Ireland, or North of Ireland, sank into civil war for 30 years, and then managed to find a way to end the violence and construct a more peaceful world. We had about 25 people on this trip, including 9 from Arizona, and 5 faith leaders were with us. We had the founder of Arizona Interfaith Power and Light, which is a group that cares for our home and climate justice. We had the regional minister and president of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Arizona. We had the co-founder of Amplify Peace, which is a global movement. Her husband happens to also be the lead pastor at Central Christian Church. And we had 2 reverends from the Arizona Faith Network. So let's start with a message from Mike Nesbitt of the Northern Ireland Assembly, who in a few words summed up what one of the major themes became from our visit.
Hi, my name's Mike Nesbitt, and I'm a member of the Legislative Assembly of Northern Ireland. I've just finished a really useful session with the Carter Centre, a delegation over here in Belfast, to discuss how you do politics better in this difficult and challenging world. I guess if we have a lesson to pass on, it is to respect difference and diversity. Here in Northern Ireland, we have Irish Republicans and Nationalists, British Loyalists and Unionists, and those who don't want to be described as any of the above. And we're still learning to rub along together. As George Mitchell put it last year when he came here to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, the only people to fear are the 100%ers. Compromise is a noble thing in a divided society.
We rub along with each other. Sometimes the rubbing can get a little rough, can't it? So let's back it up a little bit for some historical context. 55 years ago, young men in Northern Ireland were doing the exact opposite of making peace. And even today, the scars are still very much there all over the city. And in fact, a small sample of which you're going to see as Braden rotates through some of our slides here. So Loyalist Union British Protestants who wanted Northern Ireland to become a part of Great Britain, and the Nationalist Republican Irish Catholics who wanted Northern Ireland to become part of the Irish Republic, they hated each other. The so-called Reverend Ian Paisley, a Methodist preacher and a Unionist leader, was holding rallies demonizing Irish Catholics as subhuman, whipping up mobs of angry working-class people to arm themselves and to prepare to fight. Mobs marched through Irish Catholic neighborhoods waving British flags and celebrating the 300th anniversary of Protestant King William of Orange, who defeated Catholic King James II, ensuring that Protestants would continue to rule Ireland kind of not unlike what we saw in Charlottesville in 2017 with white nationalists waving Confederate and Nazi flags at the Unite the Right rally that occurred there. Eventually, all of this led to full-scale violence and 30 years of civil war. And people used anything they could to fight. Guns, of course, but rocks, pipes, homemade bombs. In Belfast, the Reverend Dr. Gary Mason, a Methodist preacher who founded Rethinking Conflict in 2015, gave us a perspective on the extent of the violence in Northern Ireland. He was our host for the trip. He's been doing peace-building work in Belfast and the Middle East, and was one of the faith leaders who helped bring about peace in Ireland. During the Troubles, he said, there were over 3,500 deaths and more than 47,000 people were injured. Now, this is in a country of 1.5 million people. So as an equivalent conflict like that, if it were to occur in the United States, would result in 9 million casualties and over 750,000 deaths. So one afternoon, we sat listening to two people who had been victims of violence. One was a man whose wife was killed by a bomb made by the Irish Republican Army. The second was a woman whose son was murdered by British loyalist militia. The British man told us he had been in a building with his wife when a bomb exploded. He held her in his arms as she died. The Irish mother told us that her son had just gone out to the pub for a bit and expected him to come back at any moment. But when the knock came on the door, it wasn't from him, it was from the police asking her husband to come and identify the body. They were both still angry, they're both still hurt, both still grieving, but neither one of them wanted their sides to keep fighting. Both sides caused pain, they said, and both sides suffered pain. At some point, you just have to stop. You have to stop demonizing the other side. You have to stop using nasty labels to refer to people who aren't like you. It's just not worth it. That's what they told us. Another day, we had a similar two-person panel discussion. Only this time, one speaker was the former commanding officer of the IRA. His name was Sean Murray. You'll see him on the video in a second. The other was a former commanding officer of a loyalist militia, Winston Irvine. They were the ones who had given orders, who pulled triggers, who basically tried to kill each other. But here they were, sitting next to each other, telling their stories. We weren't sure that they actually liked each other now. It wasn't exactly real touchy-feely, but they seemed to have a mutual respect for what they've been caught up in, and a belief that violence would not get them what they wanted, a belief that they just couldn't give up anything on their side. That's what they were always believing through all of these conflicts. Eventually, they came to see that there was only one island, and that they'd both feel safer if they could talk through their differences instead of trying to kill each other. Is that peacemaking? Yeah, at least it's a start. But here's a message from the High Sheriff of Belfast, who's with the Lord Mayor of Belfast. You'll also hear from Sean Murray and Winston Irvine. And you'll see comments from the Reverend Gary Mason along one of the walls that divides nationalist and loyalist neighborhoods, as you'll see, still standing today. That's okay. I'm throwing you curveballs today. Sure. These signs are all over the city, and these are just a few samples. They're everywhere. So you can't go anywhere in Belfast without seeing signs of the past.
I remember hearing the first bomb in Belfast as a young man. Little did I know it was going to last for 25 and 30 years. And one of the things that I've found over the years is that people need to sit down and talk. One thing you learn, we could hurt one another, we could damage one another, but we couldn't beat one another in terms of our politics.
Whatever help we can provide, whatever advice we can give in terms of our lived experiences, we're more than willing to do that.
Word separation, you're separated from the other. Then the word perception. So I'll ask you as Republicans and Democrats, what is your perception of a Republican, particularly if you don't know them, and what is your perception of a Democrat, particularly if you don't know them? So perceptions are phenomenal things in stoking conflict as well. But then when you meet them, reality. Maybe my perceptions were not real. Maybe they were fictional, because I actually do have some things in common with this political opponent. And then the whole concept of fear. How do you deal with fear of the other? How does trust come about? And how does belief come about?
And the lessons we learnt are this. The importance of dialogue cannot be overestimated. People have the power to change the circumstances in which they find themselves in. And I certainly would encourage people to stretch themselves, to move outside their comfort zones, and to begin to try to understand those who they see as their enemy, as their opponent, as those who are in difference with them politically or culturally or otherwise, and to see people as people, to see beyond the enemy image that so often dominates the discourse.
He was the envoy in Northern Ireland at the time. And
I remember
who really helped negotiate the peace agreement, which is called the Good Friday Agreement, which they talked about before. So one of the things that struck us most at the root of so much of the violence was just a basic disagreement over basic human rights. Is it fair for British Protestants to get all housing and good jobs because 300 years earlier, William of Orange defeated James II? Is it okay to bully children at school because they've got different sounding last names or maybe a different accent? Is it okay for wealthy people to own excessive amounts of land and still demand full rent payments during a potato famine? Most people, it seems, won't turn to violence if their basic needs are met, if they're treated with just a little bit of a degree of respect. One of the panelists said, when one's identity is impunged, when people look down their noses at my community, when people don't get a fair shot, when people get bullied, I hate getting bullied. Sometimes people just have to have their basic needs met. So much violence is rooted in basic lack of human rights and human dignity, and that was a lesson that we learned loud and clear over there. One of the most humbling statements of the trip came when someone asked about the role of the churches in this whole conflict. Neither Catholics nor Protestants have at the core of their religion a commandment to kill their neighbor. We hear about it being a conflict between Catholics and Protestants, but it was really a conflict between Irish nationalists who happen to be Catholic and British loyalists who happen to be Protestant. It seems that if churches had spoken up, if they had just taken the lead, they might have avoided civil war. But churches stayed silent, or worse. Certainly the Reverend Ian Paisley, Methodist minister, stirred up a lot of trouble. But most of the rest of the pastors stayed silent and supported their own people. They didn't want to risk alienating their congregations by calling for people to love their enemies, to recognize the image of God in those people on the other side of the border. As churches stayed silent, neighborhoods burned. Now, some have blamed preachers for not preaching. Others have blamed people for not listening. A lot of preachers who wanted to preach about the wideness of God's mercy, about Jesus' persistence in crossing the aisle and dining with lepers and tax collectors and Roman centurions, but they were afraid. They were afraid to preach what they truly believed because they were afraid they'll be fired. And it happens, and it did happen. Churches are supposed to grant freedom of pulpit to encourage pastors to bring a difficult and challenging word, because how else are we going to grow? But it doesn't always happen, and it didn't happen then. It's risky, they said, to preach the full gospel of Jesus Christ, to tell a violent mob not to cast the first stone. To preach Christianity is all about learning to respect and welcome our enemies and treating them fairly. We can understand why churches in Northern Ireland were silent, but still, if we don't ask, what's the point? We heard them say today that God doesn't need a church that lives in fear, that tries to protect itself while its neighborhood burns. So you can blame preachers or you can blame people, but you can't blame women. A key moment in the whole peace process occurred when women decided to come together. I don't know if they were following Jesus or were just sick and tired of seeing their sons and husbands being gunned down and blown up. But eventually, Irish Catholic women started meeting with British Protestant women and sharing their stories of loss and grief. And then they started telling their husbands and sons to knock it off, to stop, to lay down their weapons and start talking to the other side. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the daughters of God. You can start doing slides 14 through 20, because there are some signs of peace that occurred there, and we'll see some of those in the next round of slides as well. So at the same time, a small number of preachers got over their fear and they started talking to the other side. A few Catholic and priests and Protestant ministers started meeting with militias, started talking about negotiating a peace agreement. Loyalists wouldn't talk with nationalists, but Catholic priests would talk to Protestant ministers. So they'd have secret meetings in their church buildings. A Catholic priest talking to the IRA, a Methodist minister talking to a Loyalist militia. As they talked to each other, they recognized the need for both sides to be seen as human beings, to be seen as children of God, whose peoples and needs just had to be met. Imagine if we were holding secret meetings right here in Hutton Hall with the Proud Boys. That's the kind of thing that was going on. Ministers were risking their lives, they were risking their jobs, risking their reputations, but they went forward with it, and eventually it worked. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. One of the things they told us was, you have to talk to everybody. The Reverend Gary Mason, the Methodist pastor leading our event, said, I would talk to anyone, no matter how awful of the things they have done. I would talk to anyone in order to seek peace. And he did. And he was one of the leaders in this effort. You don't make peace with your friends, he said. You make peace with your enemies. I contrast that with how many of us find it tough sometimes to have conversations with our relatives at Thanksgiving dinner. It's so easy to demonize people, to label them as thugs and murderers, or as baskets of deplorables. The lesson from Northern Ireland, demonizing people leads to civil war, and there's nothing civil about war. So finally, the Good Friday Agreement was reached in 1998, and that brought an end to the violence. But as you can see, the scars still remain, and the memories are still very painful. We'll end with some comments from some young people who were born after the Troubles and did not experience the violence, though they could certainly understand it. All of their families were affected. Their messages of hope and promise are inspiring in a land where not long ago that did not exist at all. So the last video, Braden.
Belfast today, I think, is somewhere opportunity. I think there could be more potential unlocked in Belfast, but I think if you look at the Belfast of 30 years ago compared to the Belfast of today, there just isn't a comparison. America played such a big role in our peace process. We had American negotiators come over here and lead us by the nose to a peace agreement. So to see America becoming the place that there needs to be reconciliation and almost a conflict resettlement happening is really quite ironic. So I would almost tell them to look at their own foreign policy history in Ireland and learn their own lessons of pushing towards cross-community consensus and trying to meet somewhere in the middle.
We are creating a Belfast that is a Belfast for all. Look at the good things that we've done, that we've actually achieved in Northern Ireland, and learn from them and take those good things and implement them in the USA.
You have to do the hard work. You have to be in relationship. No problem gets solved in an abstract, in a vacuum. You have to get up close and personal. And I think in America, people need to get comfortable being uncomfortable with each other. They need to be in the same rooms. They need to be talking, disagreeing, but in a way that doesn't lead to violence. I would say that Belfast today is a much more vibrant and open and inclusive place than it was 25 years ago. Being able to understand someone's context, understand someone's narrative, especially those that don't share the same values, beliefs, or hold the same ideologies that you do. Being able to create a connection and a commonality has allowed me to positively impact on the issues that I'm concerned about.
You just put the last slide up, that'd be fine. Sometimes our young leaders have the best advice, right? So I'll end with a traditional Irish blessing. May the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face, the rain soft upon your fields, and until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of her hand. With that, I'll open the floor to questions. Got plenty of time left, so let's get a good dialogue going about what we learned over there. Who's got questions?
What was your personal experience?
We spent a week there, and so it wasn't like one day in and out looking at it. It was like when you just go through that for a week. The most amazing thing was listening to the panel of folks who were fighting each other. And then they had come together now sitting next to each other and being civil. I mean, they may not be best friends, but they learned how to come together. And watching that, and then watching the pair who lost relatives and just hearing their stories, and I tell you, to get you right here. And I guess the thing I took away from it was, I just hope we're not in that same position right now, where things are just kind of bubbling below the surface. And if we don't pay attention and start talking about basic values with each other, then I don't want to say there's going to be a civil war, but they didn't think it was coming either. And they had a lot of strife over all those years and lots of struggles, and then all of a sudden it blew up for 30 years. And isn't it ironic that it took a negotiator from the United States to go over and bring peace there? And now we're finding it difficult to have peace right in our own country. So that's the lesson we learned, is hopefully enough of us will start paying attention, looking for early warning signs, doing the work like our network is doing, trying to talk to people, bringing both sides, people from both sides of the aisle together to communicate and talk and realize that we're all human beings and that we're all live in a community, and we just need to figure out how to disagree agreeably. Other questions? Yeah?
Hi, I'm Marja Fritzy, and my question is kind of on the journalist side. What would you hope to see from there over the coming years? Or are there some specific actions or accomplishments? They're clearly on a good path. What would you hope to see?
I'd hope to see peace continue. It's still pretty fragile. You could take tours over there, taxi tours, or even if you're on a bus talking to the bus driver, there's still some pretty tough talk going on. They still don't, there's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of open wounds. There's a lot of people over there who lost relatives still today. And it's not that far away that in their memories, and the pain and the grief is still there. So I guess the lesson would be that it's not solved, but it's at least solvable, and they got to keep working together. I also was encouraged to see so many newspapers over there. Being a newspaper guy myself and seeing newspapers kind of going down here, it's like, there's all kinds of newspapers over there. In fact, Mike Nesbitt is a journalist too, the guy that we first heard from in the Parliament, which is cool to see. Yeah.
I'm Tom Tisher. The College of Atlantic in Maine this summer, it has a symposium, a week-long symposium every year. And this year it was on democracy. And we were privileged to hear Supreme Court Justice, getting his name, there was written a book on the issues of democracy, which are at stake here, center around the need for truth communities. And David Brooks talks about it in his last chapter of his book, How to Know a Person. And it's a good place to start. And truth communities have been the bulwark, the basis of our democracy. And we need to know our own truth. And it really starts from what you see in the mirror. And pretty much the story is in your mirror of how you see the world. And it was brought out over and over again in different ways in this week-long speaker series on democracy. And there's great hope. We have, particularly in our science and medical field, for great improvement in humankind. We have probably the best medical thing that's happened to us in recent past is COVID-19. And so we need to look at what came out of COVID-19 and what we can come out of this troubling time in the same light, because there's lots of solutions that we don't know about, and wisdom is really knowing what we don't know.
Thanks, Tish. Those are good comments. I'll tell you a couple other reasons why I have hope. So we're part of a bunch of different groups through the Arizona Democracy Resilience Network, but we're also part of a group called the Defending Democracy Coalition. It's made up of about 30 groups here in Arizona that meet on a regular basis, and we communicate with each other on a regular basis, and we're doing things all the time to address some of these issues that we're talking about. And in the ADRN, I'm the Republican member. Congressman Ron Barber, former Congressman Ron Barber, is the Democrat. The reason I say that is because we're also in the middle of, we have just created a group called the Conservative Agenda for Arizona, which is made up of conservatives and Republicans who feel like they've lost their way a little bit with the Republican Party, but they're not election deniers. And they share the same values as the values that we're espousing with the Arizona Democracy Resilience Network. I bring that up because there's a lot of people, even to the right side of the aisle, that are real concerned about where our democracy is heading and want to work on it. And when I start looking at all the people out there doing this kind of work, that's what gives me hope. That we will put our hands around this, we'll talk to each other, we'll learn from good speakers. And I also get hope by our own bishop, who put on a series this past week that brought in a really well-known author and speaker, the Reverend Jim Wallace, and he was at Trinity Cathedral on Thursday, maybe it was Wednesday, I can't remember now. Dynamic, and his latest book is called The False White Gospel, and he talked to us about several messages of hope as long as we come together as Christians, and we keep our eye on that ball and keep our eye on the values of what Christianity means, then there's hope.
I'm Joanne Thierstein. How would you apply what you learned to the foment that's occurring in the, and I'll forget the words, the internet interfaces like YouTube and X and Facebook and Twitter and all of those things?
That is such a good question. In fact, I asked that very question several times when I was in Belfast, and they all said they were scared as heck. And that if they had the internet back there, how much harder it would have been to bring people together for peace. Because the internet right now can be a cesspool, as we all know. And it can fuel, and are we eating kittens in Springfield, Ohio? Come on, you know. It can set things off in ways that just have terrible effects. So I think if the internet had been around back in the Troubles, we might not have peace today. That's what they were saying anyway, because it's just a cesspool out there. And there's really no way to control it. One of the things that we try to do from our networks, and this is happening in all of the groups that I just mentioned, is when we see false information out there and disinformation, we try to have a rapid response to correct it with facts, so that at least we're able to get out into our communities and our networks with what facts are against the mis and disinformation that we're seeing, because it's out there all the time. Some more dramatic than others, but so when the need is there, at least we have a way to respond rapidly with facts trying to correct that information. That's one of the things that we're doing.
Here I come with the mic. Hold on. It's first so Zoom can hear the question. Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm Linda Simon from Dayton, Ohio, very close to Springfield, actually.
Yeah.
How do we access the information? I am getting so conflicted about what's true and what's not true, to the point where I've almost stopped watching political discussion, because the fact check, it's just very difficult. So how do we access the information that you're putting out that appears to be believable and well researched?
Well, the easiest way to explain that is don't rely on one source for information. You know, and if you're really serious about understanding what facts are, then make sure you're listening to several different sources. Don't watch CNN or Fox. Watch them both. And look for ways that you can get your information from a variety of sources. It gets a little easier to tell the truth that way. And then look for other trusted messengers. If we're one, then sign up for what we're doing and we'll put you in our database and give you information. Our faith leaders is another. I mean, people trust their faith leaders, right? And so that's a source of information for people as well. So look for trusted sources of information that you know you can trust, and then look for sources, a variety of sources to help give you some balance to understand what you're seeing and reading. That it's very hard to do. It takes work. So if you really want to understand the truth, you need to work at it a little bit, and that's one thing maybe people aren't so willing to do sometimes. Just take whatever you see in social media and immediately respond. That's the truth. Well, maybe not. You got to work to find the truth sometimes.
Debbie Webster, and I find my heart and my prayers going for the post-election time, where no matter what happens, there will be brokenhearted, frightened people, huge portions of the population crushed and a huge portion infuriated, and then others elated. And then how I've tried to kind of think what the church can be in that moment right after this all happens, and whatever happens following the actual election, and then what precedes it, so that we can be a place that people could come, whatever that their grief or their joy, but it could still be something that would be together. So I'm just throwing that out because I don't know if your experience there, and what you're doing, you have a picture of that, or what that would even look like?
I wish we knew. We're worried. We're probably more worried about what happens after November 5th than we are what happens before. We're working hard right now to set up the infrastructure and have the foundation to be able to respond to whatever happens after the election, so we can react that way. But we don't know. And no matter who you talk to, they don't know either. We have regular connections with law enforcement that are watching before the election, watching polling places and things like that, and monitoring. We have partnerships with organizations that monitor all the chat stuff that's in chat rooms around the internet, whether it's the Proud Boys talking in Yavapai County or somebody down in Cochise. We've got actually folks that are monitoring those activities and then alerting us as to where there may be some problems. There's nothing out there right now that's visible, but preparing that way as well will at least help our network and then all the other groups that we're working with to be able to respond in whatever way we need to. And I think churches and religious institutions are a vital part of what we're talking about. Again, where do you come back to your values and your trusted messengers and communities that you can trust? It's right here.
Steve Herman. Are there any lessons from Northern Ireland with respect to there was the Methodist minister who was sort of inciting folks. So how do you neutralize those sorts of leaders? How was it there, and how might it apply here?
Well, as you can tell, it took them 30 years to figure that out. And that was the scary thing. And we see some of that now with some of the more Christian nationalists that are off espousing and fueling the fire of some of the crazy stuff that's out there. But there's also a perception that all evangelicals are necessarily doing evil things. They're not. This is still a relatively small part of the population, but I don't know how you convince people otherwise. Sometimes what we have talked a lot about is there's a certain part of the population that's going to believe all the crazy stuff no matter what you do with them. So can you just contain that and then work on everybody else? So from everybody else, get factual information out. Whether they're Republicans or Democrats, doesn't matter. But just get factual information out to anybody out there who will be receptive to hearing it. We haven't even tried to go after the far right, even the religious leaders that you're referring to, because we're not going to get them. So can we just kind of keep them contained a little bit while we work on everybody else? That may not be the greatest strategy, but it seems to be, right now, the only way to go.
Was there a consensus or conversation that led to sort of agreement about what the role of American mainline churches like St. Barnabas is between now and January 6th? What is the ideal of what we should be doing as faith leaders and as a Christian community?
That's a great question. Not so much a consensus from there, but from what we're hearing in our own networks and what we heard from the Reverend Wallace the other night, is just stick to Christian values and keep your communities together and not be afraid to talk about it and practice good listening. And I look at some of the things that people talk about and I think back to some of the things we're actually doing here. the series of on authentic listening that we've been doing over the past, which when Reverend Jim was still here. I mean, that concept is magic, and that's what we all need to be doing in our community. So more of that in our communities, I think, is really important, and that started right here at church. So just having the ability to, it puts pastors in a really rough situation trying to talk between divides. But if they can focus on value, sometimes that seems to be what pulls everybody together. Other questions? Yeah.
Regina, sort of a funny, very true story that happened to a friend of mine recently. A gentleman was working on her home and he rekeyed her house. She forgot to tip him and she went into the parking lot, and on his truck he had a expletive Biden sticker, and she just sort of stood there and froze, and he said, "Well, which are you, a Democrat or Republican?" And she just froze. And he said, "Well, we've bought up all the guns. We know how to use them, and we're ready to use them. And by the way, I just keyed your house." Now I'm going to ask you again, are you a Republican or are you a Democrat? And my friend said, "I'm Canadian." So my solution from now, I'm just like, I'm Canadian.
Move to Canada? I like that. That's great, Regina. True story. Yeah, for sure. More I love this conversation. Keep it coming. Chris.
Chris. Can you introduce yourself?
I will. I'm Chris Radke, and I'm not Canadian. But yeah, you had mentioned, kind of implied or inferred, I guess, just the reactivity in everybody. And, Robert's sermon this morning about the words and how quickly they can take over a situation. So kind of amazed still at how quickly that bubbles up and takes hold. So your words are important to us.
Words are always important. That's something to think about. And then how do you react to them too? Sometimes it comes down to the individual, right? How do you react or what do you believe? Sometimes like Tish was saying, you gotta look in the mirror. It starts there.
Here I come. Here I come, Bruce.
Hi, I'm Bruce Williams, and I'm just curious. My impression is that disinformation, as opposed to misinformation, is a prominent provoker of the situation that we have today. Did they have to deal in Ireland with a disinformation component that's anywhere near what we're seeing today here?
They did, but it didn't flame out like it does in the internet, where all of a sudden you stick something out there and millions of people can see it within minutes or seconds even. And so misinformation is information that you pass along, that you hear, that you don't know, but you just pass it along. Disinformation becomes information that's totally wrong that you create. So that's the difference between the two. And there was both of that, like any human nature, that's probably been around forever. People spreading false stuff about folks intentionally or just without knowing. But social media has just given it a platform where it just explodes now. And so that's when they talk about, when I would ask them about what would you have done if social media was around back, 30, 40 years ago, they don't know. They just think it would have been a lot harder. It could ask as many questions as you'd like.
Ask another question. I think it's important, I don't know, from a pastoral perspective, to not leave this room with people in fear. And so I think the question I have is actually for those of us who are gathered is like, as you're hearing this and as you're processing it, I would really like to hear from all of you, like, what is it that you want from your clergy team at St. Barnabas? What is it that would be helpful? Is it prayer? Is it more conversations about what's actually going on with these threats to democracy? Like, what is helpful and formative so that we don't leave in fear and we don't feel so disempowered? That's a question for all of you. So
That's a
just
great
leave that
question.
there. But I would like to hear, I mean, like right now, like as you're sitting here, what is...
Bring in more people like this, empower the congregation to go to you with questions that they have.
Well, prayer. Yesterday I was at the quiet day and had a totally different perspective on the world afterwards. But yeah, it's hard to be prophetic and not rile and have reactions. So I look for the church to be prophetic, but at the same time, yeah, how do you do that skillfully?
Trish.
Hi, I'm Trish Rifo. I think one thing that we already do here is focus on God and on Jesus and on all of the things that you and the rest of our clergy have taught us and continue to teach us with respect to what's really important in our world. And if we focus on that, it's so powerful that, at least for me, I rely on it to get unangry. I do. When I hear something with which I disagree politically, or I hear information being repeated that I know to be untrue, I rely on focusing on the greater principles of trying my best to see God in every other human being, to try to focus on the fact that each of us is, in our own best way, trying to walk our walk, and we do it together. We have so much more in common, and forgive me, I don't mean this to be coining something that one of the candidates is saying, but it's true that we have more in common than divides us. And you all remind us of that every day, and that I lean on constantly.
Thank you.
I'm not sure whether it was Jesus, but someone said the peace that passes all understanding. And that peace in each of us is not a thought or a feeling. It's between our thoughts. And we find it in meditation and prayer.
Tracy.
Hi, I'm Tracy Cruikshank. And I can't help to, I don't know where this is, but I keep thinking of loneliness in this and the phenomenon of that and kind of where this goes with that. And I think what I also think of is healthy community. And I think that St. Barnabas does such a great job of creating that and fostering that, and that this is a safe place to ask questions. And I think that that is so important, and continuing to facilitate that for me is really important. So thank you.
I'm Bruce McNabb. I'm on a leap into the purely practical, and so you were asking what might the clergy team plan for St. Barnabas. I would say it comes from, we're hearing it all around the room, to have ready to go a kind of post-election series where there's an opportunity for people, and it's going to be largely whichever side does not win the election, or whoever feels like a loser is going to be sad, mad, vengeful or not, or looking for some way to deal with it. And if we as a church have something in place for like this hour on Sunday mornings for people to come who don't mind saying, I really don't like what happened and I'm scared that XYZ is going to happen and this and that. And there's a place to feel safe and talk about it and think together about it and pray about it. And a strictly practical pastoral thing, I think that's what it would be.
Along those lines, there are several prayer days being scheduled. A couple of more coming up in Arizona.
Yeah, the diocesan.
Diocesan one, there's one coming in Sun City, there's one in Tucson, there was one last week. And there's going to be more of that happening nationally as well. So that's before the election. So I think your point is great for after the election, doing something like that, or using the church as a way to come together. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, there's a term I've heard emerging lately, and it's called political fatigue, which kind of hit me as absolutely spot on. So I think there's so many tools that you guys have already presented over the last few months that I've heard that could kind of put a recipe box together here. I guess two of the things I bring up. Number one is the idea of welcoming. And I think, to your point, Don, that understanding another human being, their perspective is a big part of that. Number two is the aspect of look for opportunities to be kind. I think that adds empathy and a level of understanding for another human being. But yeah, when I heard that term, it was like, yeah.
Thank you.
Debbie. And Dan's point, as you're coming around this way, I would hope nobody would leave here feeling fearful at all today. I think there's great reasons for hope out there just because there's so many organizations, so many people that are paying attention to what's going on and trying to work on it. That's the good thing. If nobody was paying attention, nobody was working on it, then I might be a little afraid. But there's a lot of people doing good work trying to make sure that we all stay centered.
I would really welcome the fear, a conversation or some direction on how to lend support and love to those who really do feel threatened, that maybe I personally may not be a part of that group or those groups. And without going too much down this road, whatever you think of what the border should be, there's many, many people in this state who may feel quite threatened if one side wins in terms of deportation. And I think that's a hard one to address, but I think a willingness for the church to wrestle with that, like what is our call as Christians to those vulnerable communities, whatever we might think we need to do politically to answer that question.
That's a good point, yeah.
Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Linda Peterson Warren, and my personal piece is deeply seated in faith. And so I don't know what the church should do, and everyone else seems to have good ideas that probably can be incorporated in one way or another. But the word I haven't really heard today, and I would ask for some explanation or in-depth understanding is probably a better way of stating it. The word is respect. And respect seems to me to be central to understanding, to compassion, to a better place both personally and socially. So when we think about whatever program is decided upon and those already in place, I would like to see that word interwoven into the conversation, because the lack of respect out there is frightening. I have to admit I'm frightened, but then, it goes internally and I can get a grasp on it. So at any rate, for whatever that's worth, I make that suggestion. And once again, I have no idea what the best path is. Thank you. Thank you, Don.
Yeah, you bet. Great comment. And that came out loud and clear what we heard from Belfast, too. If they had respect for people back then, maybe they could have avoided a lot of the pain they went through. There was one over here. Somebody have their hand up over that away.
Oh, I'm coming with the mic. Sorry. I'm coming with the mic.
Karen Easton. Does the church itself, the Diocese of Arizona, have any plans for programs after the elections?
The diocese, is that what your question is? I don't know of any plans after the elections. They've already been doing some things before the election in preparation for the election.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Because the respect also goes with the acceptance of each other's opinions, and that the church emphasizes that all opinions are welcomed in the name of Christ here.
Yeah.
Can you have to hold it
Right there. Unaccustomed as I am, the acceptance of each other's opinions without labeling or as one person had brought up, demonizing people. That because people aren't going to be happy, but people should still feel like they can talk to the other side with the acceptance of each other's and live with it. I mean, like, I'm a rhino, labeled by the labels should cease. But I'm having the head of the Democrats, childhood friend, they're getting out the vote, staying at my house during the election. I always say, well, she's going to tell me her secrets. It's an interesting, scary time. And I just want everybody to feel that they have the acceptance and, as she said, the respect.
I think you could say with some assurances that Bishop Ruddle has been very active in this. She's part of our ADRN network. She's been a member and active with us there. We've done prayer days with her, with other clergy from different denominations. And so she's been very active in terms of making sure the diocese reacts to all of the things we're talking about today. Any other questions?
I can plug what's coming up for Faith Formation.
Please.
Would you like that? Okay.
I would.
So this is, first of all, thank you. Your work is really important, and we're really blessed that you're part of this community and you bring it to us. So the next 6 weeks, the idea and the umbrella is nonviolence and violence in the Christian social tradition. We will have 3 weeks on the tradition of nonviolence. I'll be leading those 3 sessions. And then we'll have 3 weeks on how religion turns violent. And Robert will be leading those 3 sessions. So next week will be a little bit of a primer on what nonviolence is and what it isn't in the Christian tradition. And then we'll look at St. Francis the following Sunday and his role in the nonviolent movement. And then the 3rd week, we'll do an interpretation of Jesus's command to turn the other cheek and how that fits into the Christian tradition of nonviolence. And all of this will become very, very salient as the election approaches and after the election. Robert will do 3 sessions from a sociological perspective on how and why religion has turned violent from a historical perspective over the years. So that's that.
Sounds great. Terrific.
You don't need that. You're
No,
mic'd. I'm
I got this one. Yep, it's fine. Thank you, everybody.